He had gone there, he said, to kick the Heil out of Hitler, you know, for liberty and freedom and battle and warrior and hero. But at that first night, he realized he was there for his men. We knew that he had done something, but not till the 50th anniversary did he start talking about it. Stories of hopping on the back of a tank to rescue a squad, saving the Libizon stallions, shooting snipers out of trees at 100 yards.
This is a sacred place, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here with you guys today. I hope you'll be blessed, encouraged, and enjoy hearing these stories. It's not based on a true story. It is a true story. So my brothers and I grew up like most boys in the 1950s and 1960s. We loved watching World War II movies on TV and at the movie theaters. And personally, I wanted to believe that my father, Philip B. Larimore Jr., who had fought in Europe during the war, had been a brave and courageous soldier. I wondered if he might have been a hero like Audie Murphy, someone I could brag to my friends about. But since Dad never talked about his experiences as a soldier, I couldn't match the tales that the other boys in the neighborhood told when they bragged about their daddies and their father's exploits on the battlefield. But Dad appeared to be a hero to me. I mean, I knew he had lost his leg in the war. And in his small office at home, the walls were covered by pictures from generals. There was one picture of Dad heading an honor guard for General Dwight D. Eisenhower, and beside him is British Field Marshal Monty Montgomery. There was another one of Lieutenant General John Wilson O'Daniel, who was known as Iron Mike. Kind of looks like an Iron Mike, doesn't he? He called my father, quote, one hell of a soldier. He signed the back of the picture, to a fighting man. It was a phrase that he had repeated each time that he presented an award of valor to my dad on the battlefield. Brigadier General Robert Young was a commander of Dad's 3rd Infantry Division in Europe, and he wrote this, with great admiration of Phil as one of the outstanding combat soldiers in World War II. His shadow box displayed only some of his medals, but included 3 of the Army's top 4 medals of valor, excluding the Medal of Honor. And in a frame by itself was the Combat Infantry Badge. Obviously, he'd been a hero, but how? My brothers and I didn't know, because he, like so many veterans, just didn't talk about the war. And then on Dad and Mom's 50th wedding anniversary, he decided, for some reason, that it was the right time, and he began to share stories about his battles in Europe alongside 2 million other young men. However, he strongly denied being a hero. He told us, he said, sons, I was just one of 550,000 casualties in the war. He added this, he said, sure, we who were wounded suffered, but there were over 100,000 who never came home. Sons, he said, those are the heroes. And starting that night and over the next few years, he began to share with us more and more stories. But I've got to be honest with you. My brothers and I didn't believe one of them. One of my brothers said, you can tell when Dad's lying. His lips are moving. But after he passed away in 2003, we discovered in the attic a footlocker filled with uniform, writing materials, hundreds of letters, a half dozen scrapbooks containing newspaper articles, not only from around the country, but around the globe. Scores of documents saved by his mother. There were even 2 history books. One was Prome's history of the 30th Infantry Regiment, and then Taggart's history of the 3rd Infantry Division, that both documented several of Dad's unbelievable stories. And I'm delighted to be able today to share just a few of those stories with you all. His story began in Memphis, Tennessee, where he was the only child of a mom who worked long days as a legal assistant, and a father who was often away for days at a time working as a Pullman conductor for the Illinois Central Railroad. But Dad was definitely a mama's boy. And to put it mildly, he was rather unruly as a boy. In fact, he was a juvenile delinquent. He was a latchkey child. He often got into trouble. He didn't do well in school, but he was an extremely gifted equestrian. He was a Boy Scout and an outdoorsman, a hunter and a marksman. It was said he could shoot corn kernels off fence posts from 25 yards. He was also a jokester and an incredible swimmer. In fact, at 12 years of age, on a dare, he and his best friend swam across the Mississippi River and back. Unfortunately, they chose to do it the day that the roaring water of the river was receding from the Great Flood of 1937. And although they started with great enthusiasm, on the swim back to Memphis, Dad's best friend Bill almost drowned. Dad had to pull him to shore on Mud Island. As a natural horseman, one of his favorite childhood memories was on his 12th birthday. His mother took he and some friends to see the stunning white dancing horses of Vienna, Austria, the world-famous Lippizaners. He vowed to see them one day. In Europe, he was going to go. And boy, did he ever, just not quite like he envisioned that he would. But because of poor grades and behavior at school, his parents sent him to military school at 13 years of age. On the left is his freshman picture. He spent 4 years at Gulf Coast Military Academy in Gulfport, Mississippi. And at GCMA, his innate gifts and talents, as well as his love of all things military, his love of his country and its history, his love of patriotism blossomed, and he quickly became the class leader. Now, academics and athletics weren't his only loves at GCMA. He also met his first romantic love there. However, whether it was because of her beauty or because of her horse is up for debate. He graduated from GCMA and advanced ROTC with honors just after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and he was proud that both his mother and father were able to attend his graduation. And then, as a 17-year-old, was admitted to and then became the youngest ever and the only 17-year-old ever graduate of Army's Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning, Georgia. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant on his 18th birthday, becoming the youngest commissioned officer in the Army in World War II. By the way, he received his Boy Scout Eagle badge 2 weeks later. Then he headed out for specialty training. He started training with the 82nd Airborne at Fort Bragg and Fort Benning. He was awarded his parachutist badge, or jump wings, and then he spent over 10 months of infantry specialty training at Alliance Air Base in Nebraska. He obtained his glider pilot wings and certification as a demolition expert. He was also an expert rifle sharpshooter and adept at winter fighting, winter baking, and winter cooking, skills he thought he would never need. Boy, was he in for a surprise. And it was during these assignments that his equestrian skills and his love for horses blossomed. At Fort Benning, he learned to fox hunt, and he fell in love with the sport, the horses, and the dogs. At Alliance Air Base, he fell in love again. It was a close race, though, between a farm girl named Sunny and her father's incredible draft horses. Again, whether it was the woman or the horses is up for debate. Just after his 19th birthday, Dad was unexpectedly transferred from the 82nd Airborne because of his demolition training to the Army's 3rd Infantry Division, which was nicknamed the Rock of the Marne, based upon its World War I exploits in Europe. The 3rd Division was also called the Blue and White Devils, and their mascot, Rocky the Bulldog, was drawn and donated to the Army by none other than Walt Disney. At the Norfolk, Virginia harbor, Dad boarded a Liberty ship that sailed for 9 days through the U-boat-infested northern Atlantic to French Morocco. On a day of rest in French Morocco, he learned how to ride the Berber war horses in Bourida. It's also known internationally as Fantasia. It's an equestrian form prominent in Morocco and other northern African countries. And then he rode the rails to Tunisia and then boarded a steamer to Naples. And while awaiting to be shipped to Anzio, he met a dressage master there in Naples who spent a few days teaching him this ancient art. And then he shipped out to Anzio in February of 1944 on an LST, a landing ship tank. He and his men called the LST a, quote, long, slow target. In fact, as their LST was pulling to shore at Anzio, the one next to them was struck by a German projectile, a 600-pound projectile that was fired from a German Anzio Annie supercannon located 10 miles away. The LST was blown sky high with the loss of all aboard. This railway gun that fired the 600-pound projectile had a 71-foot long and 11-inch bore that could accurately fire shells over 30 miles. And if they hit the earth, they would often leave a crater 50 feet deep. That wasn't the only thing that blew up that day. From Anzio, the men could see Mount Vesuvius erupting about 40 miles away. On the Anzio beachhead, which was a spit of land only 10 miles by 15 miles wide, the Allies were completely surrounded by the Germans, who were in the adjoining mountains, dug in. The GIs became sitting ducks during 4 months of 24-hour-a-day bombardments, and they had to dig deep into the ground. Dad was given command of a frontline ammunition and pioneer, or A&P platoon, in the 30th Regiment of the 3rd Infantry Division. He and his men had to work all night, every night, to deliver ammo to the front line, to lay barbed wire and razor wire, as well as to set and defuse mines in no man's land, only just a few yards from the Germans. One night, one of his men sneezed, and a German soldier in the next Wachhof said, Gesundheit. The stalemate on Anzio from January until May 1944, which Nazi propaganda labeled as, quote, death's head, was a dreadful time. It was as horrendous as trench warfare was in World War I. And the Americans and British didn't get along very well. The GIs called the Brits tea and warm beer drinkers. The Brits quipped back, well, you GIs are overpaid, oversexed, and over here. Not to be done, Dad and his men laughingly quipped back, well, you're underpaid, undersexed, and under Eisenhower. Dad was hospitalized for a severe case of malaria. It may have been the first recorded incidents of biologic warfare in war history, but that's a story for another day. In the hospital, he was offered but turned down a Purple Heart, believing only those with significant wounds should receive them. It was the first of 3 times that he turned down offered Purple Hearts during the war, not feeling worthy of the offer. He was promoted to first lieutenant on Anzio, still a teenager, at only 19 years old. Now, back then, most of the guys that joined the armed services during World War II did it for patriotism, for adventure, to defeat fascism and tyranny, to protect liberty and freedom, and to knock the Heil out of Hitler. But very soon in battle, especially front-line battle, idealism was shattered by reality. On Dad's first night in no man's land on Anzio, one of his men made a mistake with a landmine and blew his own face off. The next night, Dad was walking with one of his men at first light when the man was literally cut in half by a German 88 anti-aircraft projectile that was shot horizontally. And then the third night, one of his men made the mistake of thinking the surrender of 2 Germans was sincere. And when he stood, they ducked. And Dad's man was killed by a sniper who blew his head off. It didn't take long on the front lines for these inexperienced young patriots to be crushed by the terrors of war. and to be transformed into young men who literally were fighting for their lives, to protect their survival, to protect the future of themselves, and especially to protect the buddies that they came to love. On Anzio, the average life expectancy of a frontline second lieutenant was 21 days. And it was no wonder that he and his men called Anzio Beachhead the bitch head. But he loved his guys. He loved his men. He called them his war horses. He wrote this to his father: "I'd fight with these guys, these men, anywhere, anytime, against anyone, but I wouldn't fight against them on any day, and I pity the SOBs that have to." On Anzio, Dad pioneered the practice of training mules to carry ammo, mines, and wire to the front line each night. These mules were incredibly intelligent, incredibly sure-footed. Instinctively, they knew where the mines were planted. And when a white phosphorus flare went up at night to light up the battlefield, typically shot up by the Germans, they instinctively knew to lay down, protecting the men who hit the ground behind them. One dawn at first light, Dad's platoon was assigned to lay mines in direct view of the Germans, who were as close as 50 yards away. It was a suicide mission, and Dad knew it. He wouldn't send one of his men. He went on the mission himself, and once in view of the enemy, the ground around him was shredded by mortar, machine gun, and sniper fire. But he successfully accomplished the mission, and for his heroism, he was awarded his first Silver Star, the Army's third highest Valor Award. And then his 30th Infantry Regiment received a Presidential Unit Citation, the first of 3 in which he would share. But while on the front line with the war horses, he most appreciated receiving the Combat Infantry Badge. It was, to the GIs on the front line, the most treasured award they could get. Not only because to receive this, you had to be in active ground combat with other brave, tough, and selfless GIs, but mainly because the high-ranking guys couldn't get one. Then on May 23rd, 1944, the Allies began their long-awaited breakout from the beachhead, and they were subjected to 24/7 non-stop fighting in hellacious battles. On the first day of the breakout, the 3rd Infantry Division suffered 995 men killed or wounded. That's out of a force of 3,000 men. It was the most casualties suffered by a single division in a single day in World War II. But there was no stopping for the guys and no rest until they entered and liberated Rome. The guys didn't see themselves as conquerors, but liberators. And they were warmly greeted as such by the Italians as the liberation occurred on June 4th and 5th, 1944. This was a very big deal. In fact, every newspaper in America prepared frontline headlines highlighting the heroics of the GIs in liberating the first national capital in Europe from the Nazis. But there was a problem. Unfortunately, all of the headlines were thrown into the trash. Why? Because the next day, June 6th, 1944, something else happened. The Normandy invasion and the liberation of Rome was never really celebrated at home. And this was terribly disappointing to Dad and to his men. But at least they enjoyed a few days in Rome in a Roman holiday before beginning intensive training for what would be the 3rd Division's 5th D-Day of the war. Now, don't miss this forgotten fact. I mean, the Northern Front guys had a D-Day, and it was a big deal, no doubt about it. But the Southern Front guys slogged through 5 D-Days. Morocco, Sicily, Salerno, Italy, Anzio, and then their 5th and final D-Day, the massive amphibious assault on the beaches of southern France, October 15th, 1944. Later, Dad sent his shoulder flag patch home to his mom. The invasion, the only one in the war that was begun and carried out completely in daylight, was stunningly successful. And the liberation of countless French towns and villages began in earnest. And once again, the guys were greeted as heroes and liberators. They reveled in every moment, especially the bottles of wine, the flowers, and the copious kisses from young French women wearing their finest dresses. And Dad and his units quickly raced hundreds of miles up the Rhone River Valley, chasing the rapidly retreating, running for its life, German 19th Army. An arm wound for which he refused to leave his men for medical care resulted in his first, what he called, real Purple Heart. He and his Love Company, or Company L, also earned a second Presidential Unit Citation. And during one intense battle where his long-range marksmanship shone as he killed snipers from over 100 yards away, for that he received his first Bronze Star, the Army's fourth highest Medal of Valor. Now, the guys on the northern front moved inland from Normandy. The southern front guys were chasing the fleeing German army up the Rhone Valley, where at the end of August, in a stunning military move, an American pincher move, a disaster unfolded for the Germans. Just north of the town of Larimore, the GIs had positioned armor and artillery on either side of a narrow gorge, just below the town of La Concorde. There were steep cliffs that allowed only enough room for the narrow river rapids with a railroad track and a two-lane road on one side. It became what was called the slaughterhouse of the Rhone. In fact, the locals in this area called it the Avenue of Stenches for years. Here's why. An estimated 80 to 100,000 Germans tried to speed through that narrow gorge, where the American Army and the Army Air Corps killed 10 to 15,000 Germans. Another 40 to 50,000 were taken prisoner. There were 4,000 burnt-out vehicles and 2 freight trains destroyed. Here's one of Dad's men on one of the 3 massive Anzio anti-cannons that they captured. What shocked Dad and his men the most was to learn that horse-drawn transportation was critical for the German army. Germany was relatively lacking in an automobile industry and oil resources, so horse-drawn artillery formed most of the bulk of the German army throughout the war. In fact, only 1/5 of the German army belonged to mechanized divisions. Each German infantry, each division, employed thousands of men taking care of thousands of horses. It's estimated that about 1,500 horses perished in the carnage, but hundreds were left alive. So Dad, as an equestrian, was assigned to pick other cowboys to patrol the killing fields, to both put down any fatally wounded horses and to round up and care for the survivors. He and his best friend from training back at Fort Benning, Ross Calvert, led a bunch of hand-selected American cowboys, rural boys, to do the job. Ross later wrote home to his mother that he called the group Calvert's Cavalry. But then the winter of 1944 approached, and the GIs became the 6th major army in history to try to battle a dug-in foe in the rugged Vosges Mountains in the Alsace region of northeastern France. No one, including Napoleon, had ever been successful doing that. No one, even Napoleon, ever tried to do it in winter. And part of the reason was that because of the muddy, treacherous mountain roads, they were so narrow and so twisty, no heavy armor, no tanks, no artillery could use any of the mountain roads. So the guys were left alone. Because of the terrible weather, the low clouds, there was no air support, and it was vicious fighting. Many historians compared the intensity of the Vosges fighting to the brutal jungle battles in the Pacific Theater. And Dad was called on once again to utilize mules to help deliver ammunition, mines, and wire to the front lines almost every night. And without the mules, it had been nearly impossible, certainly far more difficult. Often Dad and his men had to join in the hand-to-hand frontline battles. The American Army became the first army in history to be successful in the Vosges. But Dad was not with them at the end of that battle. In one frontline, face-to-face skirmish, he suffered a through-and-through gunshot wound of his thigh, for which he was later awarded his second Purple Heart, or the Purple Heart, with an oak leaf cluster. After the first of 2 surgeries in a field hospital, he was evacuated to and recovered in a larger hospital in southern France. He was assigned to a bed in the officers' ward right next to a Texan a young man named Audie Murphy, who would later be awarded the Medal of Honor and is said to be the most decorated soldier in World War II. They became fast friends. Dad noticed every night that Audie would walk to the nurses' station and tried to romance one of the nurses. He even got down on his knee one night and proposed to her, but she fastly turned him down. After recovering fully, Dad was sent back to his unit on Christmas Eve, 1944. In the previous 3 months, the Army had won in the Vosges, but it was in horrible winter conditions in what was called the toughest terrain on the Western Front. And Dad and his men were awarded their second Presidential Unit Citation, and this one with an oak leaf cluster. In early January of 1945, Dad celebrated his 20th birthday. No longer a teenager, but after 12 months of front-line fighting, he was considered an old man. And now he and his men were going to have to slug it out with the Germans in the frozen Colmar pocket. Dad told me, most folks know about the Battle of the Bulge, but almost no one remembers, or else has forgotten, the fierce and potentially more disastrous Battle of the Colmar pocket. It was waged in some of the worst winter wartime conditions ever recorded. In fact, it was the worst winter in Europe in 5 decades. Stephen Ambrose, the author of Band of Brothers, wrote this: "It was fought in conditions so terrible that they can only be marveled at, not really imagined. Only those who were there can know." He added this: "More than once in interviewing veterans of the January fighting, when I asked them to describe the cold, men involuntarily shivered." But in what was almost a disastrous decision by senior leaders, the men of the 30th Regiment were dispatched on a mission with no immediate armor, artillery, or air support. The reason was that there was only one bridge available to the men and the equipment to cross. So 2 of the 30th Regiment's 3 battalions, about 650 men, were ordered to attack. Then the tanks and the support vehicles would cross behind them and quickly catch up. At least that was the plan. However, the first tank to cross the bridge collapsed it, and the Sherman tank crashed into the icy waters of the appropriately named Ill River. The men were already beyond radio contact. Even worse, the 30th Regiment had no way of knowing that they were walking into a massive German trap. They had only small arms, bazookas, and a few 57mm anti-tank guns to deal with the Germans. They were attacked from 3 sides by an overwhelming force of German tanks and infantry. In fact, an entire German tank and infantry division, along with an assault gun battalion, struck them. And with little to no cover and unable to dig foxholes because of the frozen ground, the 30th Infantry was caught off balance and forced to withdraw toward the Ill River Bridge. They took heavy casualties as the retreat turned into a rout. Of the approximately 650 men in the 2 battalions, there were 345 casualties and over 100 POWs. Nearly 2/3 of the men were wiped out of action. And the remaining men fell back to a small farm with a large red home. In French, it was called La Maison Rouge, where against all odds, the men were able to hold off a huge, superior German force through the night. The engineers behind them worked feverishly to rapidly construct several Bailey and pontoon bridges across the river. The next day, the battle, with the support of armor and artillery, turned. And by the way, that was the day on which Audie Murphy was awarded his Medal of Honor. After one of the many vicious battles in the Colmar pocket in which his company commander was killed, Dad was promoted to become the youngest company commander in World War II as a 20-year-old first lieutenant. And he was awarded his second Bronze Star with the oak leaf cluster. And after the GI's stunning victory at Colmar, as part of the 3rd Infantry Division, Dad and his unit were awarded a 3rd Presidential Unit Citation with its 2 oak leaf clusters, the Medal of France and the Forget of France. But then the tough battle began. They needed to break through the dreaded and daunting Siegfried Line. This was an incredibly fortified 400-mile-long west wall of Germany But they were able to break through, and they began to race across southern Germany, where he was awarded his third Purple Heart, his second Silver Star, and the Distinguished Service Cross, which was and is the Army's second highest valor award. This was just before the end of the war. In 15 months of brutal battles, Dad had been a second lieutenant at 18 years of age, a first lieutenant at 19 years of age when the average was 24 years of age, a captain and a company commander at 20 when the average age of those guys was 30. And his parents received this letter from Maurice Footsie Britt, pictured here, a Medal of Honor winner who had previously led Dad's L Company. He wrote this, that Dad really has something on the ball to be placed in command of a company and be as young as he is. He also has a nice collection of medals. Maurice added this, Company L is my first and last love in the Army, and I am pleased that the company has such a capable commander. Britt had played professional football for the Detroit Lions in 1941 before entering active service. He was the first person in history to receive the Army's top 4 combat decorations for valor. And then he served later as a lieutenant governor of Arkansas. Dad's bravery was also evident to me and my brothers when he told us about being part of an extremely risky, top-secret mission. He was flown in a Piper Cub far behind the enemy lines, almost 200 miles in Czechoslovakia, not knowing that the plane only had enough gas for 180 miles. But they made it. He was told that if he or the pilot were captured or killed, they would be declared AWOL, and their mission would be disavowed. If the plane successfully landed on a makeshift runway, he was to be met by the Czechoslovakian resistance and taken by horseback to confirm intelligence indicating Hitler had confiscated most of the world's population of the world-famous Lipizaners. This was at a secluded horse farm, and they were to be bred into the perfect horse for Hitler's hoped-for perfect Aryan race. The Nazi veterinarians, who were more veterinarians than they were Nazis, had asked for American help because they were terrified that these priceless horses would be killed and eaten by the Russian army that was invading Czechoslovakia from the east. In fact, before they put out the call for help, a trailer with 25 Lipizans was racing to get away from the Soviets, who caught them, killed and ate 22 of them, of the horses. So the Nazis wanted help. Dad was met at the plane by a Nazi veterinarian named Captain Rudolf Lessing. He was riding a Lipizaner, and he brought with him a saddled champion thoroughbred horse named Chug. Captain Lessing loved the horses he cared for far more than the Nazi cause. He was very concerned about some of the unethical breeding practices, and he brought this thoroughbred that was slightly ugly, had a unsightly square head. But it was just discovered that that thoroughbred was only 7/8 thoroughbred. And he was scheduled to go to be killed and go to the glue factory. Dad was able to confirm the presence of over 1,200 horses, all from royal breeds, including nearly 400 Lipizans. And to Dad and the Army's surprise, there were hundreds of American and British POWs that they didn't know were there. Fortunately, Dad and the pilot were able to take off and get back to safety. Their efforts were a success and led to Operation Cowboy, approved by General Patton, which saved the world-famous Lipizans for almost certain extinction. And it was even made into a Disney movie called The Miracle of the White Stallions. Just a few days later, on April 8th, 1945, exactly 1 month before the end of the war in Europe, Dad and his men were enmeshed in a long day of endless firefights in a heavily wooded forest in southern Germany. German snipers nestled in the towering fir trees. They were picking off his men one at a time. Machine gun nests hidden behind evergreen boughs slowed the advance of Dad and his men. Worst of all, well-camouflaged artillery fired projectiles into the tree canopy, causing them to burst above the men and rain down white-hot shrapnel on the soldiers below. One eyewitness to Dad's heroism on that fateful day, his name was Major Carroll McFalls, later wrote this. First Lieutenant Larimore had been ordered to proceed with all possible speed. Completely disregarding the considerable amount of small arms fire being delivered, he moved his leading platoon into the assault. Because of his vigorous efforts, the enemy quickly ascertained that he was a commander and redoubled their efforts to destroy him. The attack was continued through the woods against resistance from a stubborn foe. Lieutenant Larimore moved at the head of his company throughout the advance, strenuously directing the attack. So stubborn was the resistance that it was necessary to engage in hand-to-hand fighting, of which Larimore was at the center. And during the melee, Larimore killed a German officer at point-blank range with his pistol. At this point, the resistance ceased. Well, at least for a short time. Then Dad learned that one of his spearheading squads was surrounded and under heavy fire from about 150 enemy. And in the chaos, he organized an attack to save his men. He jumped on the back of a Sherman tank and went to rescue his guys. Major McFalls wrote this, quote, I saw him on the rear of the tank firing at the woods to our front, operating the .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the tank. I was actually delighted to find a tank just like the one that Dad rode at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Anyway, back to McFalls, who wrote, quote, despite the nonstop barrage of bullets which continuously struck the tank within inches of him, he coolly continued to fire, changing ammunition boxes regularly and inflicting dozens and dozens of casualties on the enemy, including wiping out 3 machine gun nests. And this allowed his men to be rescued. Dad later told the story of suddenly being shot through the hip. He didn't feel any pain, but he knew he was shot because blood was pulsing from his femoral artery down his pants. Even though he didn't feel pain, he decided to unbuckle his belt to form a tourniquet because he knew he would die quickly without it. But he kind of chuckled because when he looked down, he saw that a bullet had penetrated his canteen, and the canteen was pulsing warm water down his pants. He said later, I'm not sure that was the only thing that wet my pants that day. Just then, he was stunned by a sniper's bullet that glanced off of his helmet. When a second sniper's bullet grazed off his helmet, knocking it off his head, he jumped off the tank as it moved back into the woods and began firing his M1 Garand, killing several of the snipers and advancing Germans when he felt an excruciating jolt of searing agony in his shin. It shot up his right leg. He hit the ground groaning, and despite the unbearable pain, he managed to roll himself into a shallow ditch. The tank pulled away because the tank commander thought that he was dead. But Dad peeked over the edge, scores of Germans firing as fast as they could while screaming at the top of their lungs were rushing toward him. And when the Nazi soldiers were only 20 to 30 yards away from him, he lowered his head and played dead. Within seconds, the enemy leaped over the ditch and kept running. And in a fetal position, he put a tourniquet above the gaping wound and lost consciousness. As dusk fell, Major McFalls and a small group of men found Dad. To their shock, he was alive, but he was close to death. McFalls wrote this, quote, Larimore was lying about 10 yards from a dead German killed by himself. His wound was the size of a silver dollar. He had 2 bullet scars on his helmet, and his canteen had been penetrated by another bullet. And as he was being rushed to a field hospital, Major McFalls wrote this, a German officer and about 30 of his remaining men out of the 150, about 30 of his remaining men came out of the woods and surrendered. Upon questioning, the German officer stated that had not the tank with Lieutenant Larimore appeared, his force would have destroyed the surrounded patrol. Then the officer further stated that his men were demoralized at the appearance of the man on the tank that bullets could not stop. The surgeon saved Dad's life, but not his leg. In the hospital, he learned that he had been promoted to captain at only 20 years of age. This was the time when the average age of captains was in their mid-20s to early 30s. After his first operation, an amputation of his lower leg, he was stabilized, and while preparing to board a specially equipped C-54 military hospital plane to fly back to the States, he was met by General Eisenhower on the tarmac. This was in Reims, France. Dad wrote this about their interaction. The general greeted each man, ordering them to stay seated and at ease in their wheelchairs or on their litters. When he knelt by me, he smiled. He said, "I served as a Marne man, 3rd Infantry Division. I served as a Marne man slightly more than a year in 1940 and 41. What you guys have done over here is spectacular. Some never saw the Germans, but most of you saw too many of them. There was not a single incident in which your division failed. I can't recall the division giving up a foot of ground." Dad remembered telling General Eisenhower, "We had some great commanders." To which the general replied, "More importantly, they had great men." And then the general stood and moved to the next man. Dad was airlifted to Lawson General Hospital in Atlanta for 1 year of intense rehabilitation. There were so many amputees that the Army had 12 specialized amputee hospitals, of which Lawson was one. He had additional surgeries, eventually only having a stump where his leg had been. But he learned that Company L's previous commander, Medal of Honor awardee Maurice Britt, had also recovered at Lawson General Hospital after losing his arm. It was there that Dad helped organize what is likely the military's first formal horse or equine therapy program. And it was also there that Dad learned 2 discouraging facts. One, although young single girls loved men in uniform, especially with a lot of medals, they simply did not cotton too highly to amputees. Secondly, he was horrified to learn that the U.S. Army stipulated that any Army officer requiring an amputation would be forced to leave the military after completing rehabilitation. Now, enlisted amputees could stay in, but not officers. The policy basically said that an amputee officer was no longer a complete human or a complete soldier, and was no longer officer and gentleman material. This infuriated Dad. He believed that that policy was inane, insane, and inhumane. And he decided to formally appeal this unjust policy. He knew it would be an uphill battle, but he believed it was worth fighting for the men that he loved and served with. So after his discharge from the hospital, instead of getting booted out, Generals Eisenhower, O'Daniel, and Young, along with Dad's best friend Ross Calvert, facilitated his transfer to Fort Myers in Washington, D.C., where he served as executive officer under his former 30th Regimental Commander, Colonel McGarr. Dad also served alongside now Captain Ross Calvert, just standing to his side, who commanded the Honor Guard at Arlington National Cemetery. Now, after arriving at Fort Myer, Colonel McGarr and Captain Calvert took Dad within just a couple of days to Fort Belvoir, just south of Washington, D.C. They wanted to show him where the caisson horses, the horses that pulled the caissons for funerals, would come rest for a couple weeks after working a week of funerals, sometimes up to 8 funerals a day. When they arrived, Dad thought he recognized one of the grazing horses, a thoroughbred with an ugly, square head. He whistled, and to his shock, the horse seemed to recognize him and galloped over to him. It was Chug, the horse that he rode in Czechoslovakia. Dad thought, how did the horse buy a ticket home? Well, he had been returned to the United States, most likely on orders from General George C. Patton. He was now Dad's horse to ride and train, as they both served in the Army. When the soldiers are riding in the caisson platoon at Arlington, including the lead horse where Dad would ride, the riders are not allowed to move. They're completely frozen. And they command the horse with slight movements of their legs or feet. It's called a 2-leg lead. But Dad only had 1 leg. So he had to train Chug to a 1-leg lead. Newspapers around the country later reported that this unique accomplishment may have been the first in equestrian history. Dad and Chug became inseparable. Besides riding caisson, they competed and won national jumping shows and steeplechase races. Dad and Ross Culvert, who were semi-professional bridge players, also played bridge almost weekly with General Eisenhower at Quarters 1 at Fort Myer, as Dad's appeal process worked its way through the War Department. He was also befriended by President Truman. Here Dad is accompanying the president, laying a wreath at the Tomb of the Unknowns in a picture that circulated around the nation. And the president would occasionally visit with Dad, Ross Calvert, and some of their men from the ceremonial detail after state events at the White House. He'd play the piano and they'd sing old war songs like When the Caissons Come Rolling Along. Dad's commander at Fort Myer, Colonel McCarr, felt Dad had a good chance to win his appeal and be the first officer to stay in the service as an amputee. But also, because of a new and lengthy witness statement written by Major McFalls about the action in which Dad had lost his leg, Colonel McCarr recommended that Dad's Silver Star for that action be upgraded to a Medal of Honor. However, Colonel McCarr was concerned. Given the Army's brass's disdain towards amputee officers, he did not feel that both the Medal of Honor and the appeal should be pursued at the same time. The boards that decided both were very close. They exchanged information often. And Colonel McCarr, advised by General Eisenhower, felt that Dad would be looked at as somehow trying to game the system. So given the choice of a highly valued personal award versus helping the amputee officers who followed him continue to serve, Dad, without hesitation, chose to continue his appeal. And as a result, Colonel McCarr recommended Dad's Silver Star be upgraded to a Distinguished Service Cross.
5 p.m.
Now, the day of Dad's appeal finally came on April 15th, 1947. Now, this is a picture of Tom Cruise, not my dad. It's from the movie A Few Good Men, because Dad's hearing was just as intense as that hearing depicted by Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson in the movie. Now, Dad was nervous, but he chose to represent himself instead of having JAG officers represent him before a group of 5 colonels. And I was actually able to find the transcript of the hearing in the National Archives. It was appalling. It was appalling how the Army brass viewed officers who were amputees. One of the colonels exclaimed, "You're a handicap to the Army. You're a cripple." Mind you, a highly decorated cripple, but still a cripple. Dad felt the blood rush to his face, but took a deep breath and slowly let it out. "Sir," he said, "I've held 9 months temporary duty at Fort Myer with superior ratings all the way through. I've been second in line for the ceremonial attachment. I have a job promised me at Fort Benning as an instructor by Major General John O'Daniel, the commandant of the infantry school and the commanding general there. I was requested there because of my 15-month combat experience with a line company and because the Army is desirous of having experienced combat officers, especially amputee officers, train new officers. I realized that the policy of the War Department is that enlisted men with amputations can go back to duty, but officers cannot. I feel in my mind and have been told that the Army is planning on changing that policy to match what the War Department is doing for the enlisted men. If they do so, and with your support, I wish to be the first officer to accept a regular Army commission as an amputee under the new regulation." Shockingly, another colonel exclaimed, "That's all pretty dressing, Captain, but the Army is already preparing for its next war. We don't need one-legged handicaps." Another added, "Amputee officers simply don't have a place in our Army." And it was clear that he was no longer considered fully human and certainly no longer considered worthy to be considered an officer and a gentleman. My father lost his appeal by the razor-thin margin of 3 votes to 2. After all the battles, after the death in Europe, the daily torment and agony of being on the front line in trench warfare, after a terribly long and difficult rehabilitation, and after a crushing legal hearing, Dad felt like his resilience tank was empty. His capacity to withstand and recover from any further trauma or trouble was going to be gone. His self-image was shattered. His future was uncertain. After all he'd been through, he just didn't know if he wanted to go on. And he considered ending it all. He always wanted a career in the Army, but that had been stolen from him. Not just by a German sniper, but by the Army and the country that he dearly loved. It was during this time of deep despondence, this time of depression, that my dad at least had the strength and wisdom to seek some help. He went to visit an Army chaplain, and they had a series of heartfelt conversations. And after confessing his feelings to the chaplain, he heard this life-altering advice. Son, your wounds, your physical, emotional, and spiritual wounds will either make you a bitter person or a better person. They will either harden your heart or soften it. You'll either be a person changed for the worse or one who chooses to make both your life and the world better. Son, your resilience does not depend on what others do to you or what the world foists on you, but your resilience, and indeed your very survival, will depend completely on how you choose to respond. The chaplain added, the worst handicap in life, Captain, isn't being disabled, it's being disabled with a bad attitude. The Germans smashed your leg, the Army crushed your hopes and dreams, but don't let them shatter your heart, your talents, your gifts, your will, and your faith in God and His plan for you. But the choice is up to you. Son, the choice is up to you. And Dad said that his prayers and his outlook began to change. He began to ask for God's wisdom and guidance and the support of family and friends to survive and maybe even thrive through the storms and challenges that lay ahead. He was honorably discharged at the age of 22 when the average age of majors in the Army was double that. And he learned that the Distinguished Service Cross had been awarded to him. Colonel McCarr, now promoted to general, along with Generals Eisenhower, Young, and O'Daniel, arranged a ceremony at Fort Myer, attended by his fiancée, where a parade of 2 battalions from the Military District of Washington, the Caisson Platoon, and the National Honor Guard from Arlington Cemetery turned out to honor him. President Truman helped him with an admission to the University of Virginia, where he earned room and board by living in a large estate, Red Acres Estate, owned by one of President Truman's donors, who was also ambassador to Canada. And this is where Dad oversaw the horses and stables of the local fox hunt activities. The only thing he didn't have was a good horse. Well, then he received a call from Ross Calvert that his horse, Chug, was to be auctioned off at Fort Myer. The minimum bid for horses was $50. It doesn't sound like much, but it's $750 in 2025 dollars. He didn't have it, but his father loaned him the money and bought him a train ticket from Charlottesville back to Washington. The next day he went to the auction and was greeted by some bad news. Chug was to be in the last 4 horses auctioned off. The other 3 of those 4 horses belonged to Eleanor Roosevelt, General George Marshall, and General George Patton. He then knew that he wasn't going to be able to afford Chug, but decided to stay to find out who would buy him. When it came to that night, for the final 4 horses, the one that went before Chug, General Marshall's mount, sold for $330, about $5,000 in today's money. And then a miracle happened. There was a gasp. This is reported in the papers. There was a gasp as a stableman led an immaculately groomed horse into the arena. It was Chug. His coat was shiny and gleaming. His ears were at attention, his eyes bright and alert as they darted around the darkened arena. Dad thought, don't be scared, Chug. You're going to do fine. Dad slowly rose and walked to the railing and whispered, I'm here, buddy. Dad felt his lips pucker, and he let out an almost inaudible whistle. And he smiled as he saw Chug look in his direction. He knows I'm here. He knows it. The murmuring from the crowd grew. He muttered, they know you're special, buddy. Stand proud. The auctioneer picked up his mic, and then his voice echoed across the arena. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a favor to ask. Please listen carefully. I've never made this request before, and I may never make it again. And the audience in the arena strained every eye towards the auctioneer as the silence deepened. Please don't bid on horse number 5. This horse has been trained by an Army man, a combat veteran, a hero who won decorations. The horse has learned to respond to the soldier's left knee lead. You see, this soldier lost his right leg in combat. I'm opening the bidding at $50 minimum. $50. Who'll bid $50? Dad's trembling hand reached back and struggled to pull out his wallet for what seemed like an eternity. Then he fumbled the billfold, which fell to the floor. He quickly reached down, picked it up, pulled out 5 $10 bills. $50 right here, he yelled as he waved the bills above his head. The bid had hardly been shouted when the auctioneer banged his gavel down and boomed, "Sold! Sold to the soldier for $50. Newspapers reported that the crowd erupted in thunderous applause. Almost simultaneously, Dad whistled, and Chug jerked free from the stable hand and sprinted across the dirt arena as Dad quickly hopped down the 3 steps into the arena. He walked briskly up to his buddy. After hugging Chug and getting nuzzled in return, he smiled in appreciation as he waved gratefully to the crowd and led his horse away to a deafening ovation. The story was carried in papers across the nation the next few days. One newspaper man reported, quote, "No doubt Major Larimore is proud of the decorations he won during his 15 months in Europe, but we'll bet he's a lot prouder of Chug." Another wrote, quote, "It's the relationship between a young soldier with only one leg and his 4-legged friend who seems to understand him." As Dad brushed Chug in the paddock, he told another newspaperman he hadn't much to look at. He's 10 years old, and even I have to admit he's got a mighty ugly head. But boy, can Chug water jump. Just the other day, he thudded down the turf for a takeoff like one of those newfangled jet planes, and he cleared the bar at a height of 5 feet 6 inches with me bent low in the saddle. A final correspondent asked, "I understand Chug was going to be euthanized by the Germans at one time. Is it true you saved his life?" Dad shook his head. "Actually," he said, "Chug saved mine." Dad finished college with a BS and master's from the University of Virginia. Here he is pictured with his proud dad. My father married the love of his life, and because of doing stuff like this, while still in school, Mom and Dad had their first of 4 boys. Little old me. Despite having to wear a wooden leg, Dad became a fox hunting master, a renowned award-winning equestrian, and yet he and Mom could dance the night away. He then succeeded in a 50-year-long career as an esteemed professor of cartography, map-making, at Louisiana State University, which he jokingly called Harvard on the Bayou. He published several books, founded and oversaw the Louisiana Geography Bee for years. For decades, he was a beloved scoutmaster. He discipled dozens of young men, several of whom named their firstborn sons after him. But most of all, he was a loyal and devoted husband and father to me and my 3 brothers. He and Mom were active in church, but Dad didn't wear his spiritual faith on his shirt sleeves like so many people did. In fact, I questioned his faith. At one time, I challenged him on it. He thought for a moment and said, "Son, in World War II, there was a popular phrase, 'There are no atheists in foxholes.' The Department of War reported that on the battlefield, less than 1% of soldiers said they were atheists. Walt, in the heat of war, men in intense combat almost always pray. That was true for me, and that was true for my men." And then he reached into his wallet. He pulled out an unfolded piece of paper. He unfolded it and handed it to me. He said, "This is what I came to believe in combat." He asked me to read it out loud, and I did. It said this: "No shell or bomb can on me burst except my God permit it first. Then let my heart be kept in peace. His watchful care will never cease. No bomb above nor mine below need cause my heart one pang of woe. The Lord of hosts encircles me. He is the Lord of earth and sea." I was embarrassed that I had questioned him. I handed it back to him. And as he folded it up, he said this, Walt, I couldn't have survived 15 months, 415 days, but who's counting, of living hell. A bloody trail of 3,200 miles in 7 countries. I couldn't have done it without the Lord walking with me every step. And you need to understand this, he said. True faith is demonstrated not by words, but by a heart that overflows with gratitude and loyalty and service. I think that's why his favorite Bible verse was James 2:17. It says, so you see, faith by itself isn't enough. Unless it produces good deeds, it's dead and useless. He passed away peacefully in his sleep on October 31st, 2003. He had a reserved plot in a special area of Arlington National Cemetery, in fact, right next to the burial site of his friend, Ross Calvert. But he chose to be buried closer at home with full military honors. He wanted to be close to family and friends. A 2022 book about his amazing exploits was published at First Light. It was a labor of love based on over 15 years of research that involved traveling to and studying at nearly 24 archives, museums, cemeteries, military installations, 8 states, 3 foreign countries, including Italy, France, and Great Britain, along with studying over 1,200 written sources, including books, magazine, journals, letters, and even a dozen unpublished memoirs by men he fought with in his unit. In 2023, the LSU Military Museum in Baton Rouge, which now has archived all of these materials, opened an exhibit about Dad that continues to be their most popular exhibit. LSU even dedicated one of their memorial live oak trees to him outside of the Geosciences building, where he was a professor for almost 50 years. Even better, in 2023, Dad was inducted into the Army's 3rd Infantry Division's Marne Hall of Fame. He was inducted alongside his buddy, Audie Murphy. And he was inducted the same day as his commanders, Generals Marshall, Eisenhower, Ridgway, O'Daniel, and Bakar. There was a memorial paver placed outside the National World War II Museum in New Orleans when his book, At First Light, was featured as one of the top 10 World War II books in 2023. A commemorative paver is placed at the U.S. Army Center of Military History at AHEC, the Army Heritage and Education Center, and Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And next week, on March 27th, he'll be inducted into the Army's Officer Candidate School, or OCS, at Fort Benning, Georgia. I'm so glad to say Fort Benning and not Fort. Anyway. For you barbecue lovers, Mission Barbecue up there in Colorado Springs has placed a nice memorial to him right at the front door. And now in 2025, we can celebrate the 250th anniversary of the birthday of the Army that my dad and many of you love. The 100th anniversary of Dad's birth, the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, and the 80th anniversary of the birth of Army equine therapies that today are successful across our great nation because of the vision of a 20-year-old amputee, and the 75th anniversary of military officers with a major limb loss finally being able to serve the military and the country they love because of a young amputee who fought for them, fought for their honor, fought for their future instead of personal glory. Well, I need to finish. I mean, obviously it's an important story to me and my brothers, but besides being that, why should it matter to you? Let me suggest 3 possibilities for you to consider. First, never forget. I wanted to detail how Dad and the men with whom he fought on the front lines of the now forgotten Southern Front in Europe were resilient in facing and conquering fear, heartbreak, dread, chaos, stench, casualties, wounds, and unimaginable opposition almost every day. Too many times to count. They entered battles they feared would end in inevitable defeat or certain death. They deeply appreciated that many of their buddies in battle had left their all on the altar of war. Those guys, the heroes, he said, willingly sacrificed their tomorrows for our todays. Of that forgotten front, the general who led those men, General Lucien K. Truscott of the 3rd Division, said this: "Officers and men under my command established records that were not equaled by others. Not in this war, not in any war. They've not been excelled by any other to my knowledge. In large measure, these magnificent accomplishments passed without full recognition. In other words, he and his men had been forgotten." General Truscott was referring to the forgotten facts that of the 89 divisions in World War II, the 3rd Infantry Division was one of the first in battle, fought longer than any division in World War II. The Northern guys fought 336 days. These guys fought over 900. It was the only division to fight in all 8 major European campaigns. It suffered the most casualties of any division. It was awarded the most medals of honor, the most silver stars, the most distinguished unit citations, and it was the first to reach the Eagle's Nest, not the Band of Brothers. But even today, most of us have either forgotten or are unaware of their amazing success. General Truscott said it this way as the sun set behind him at the U.S. cemetery at Anzio on the first Memorial Day after the war. As he stood to speak, he turned his back to the large crowd of politicians and dignitaries and celebrities, and he faced thousands of white marble tombstones. And he first quietly addressed his men. He apologized to them for any mistakes of judgment that he had made that had cost them their lives. And then after speaking to them, he then turned to the crowd and he said this: "We cannot look back to them if we do not look forward to the future for which they fought and died. The cost has been great, almost at times too great." He added, "It's now our task to build the future on the solid foundation laid by those who have left us forever, never forgetting those who march with us in memory." So maybe we can pledge together to resurrect and remember the memory of the suffering and sacrifices and the successes in the Southern Front in Europe. A second reason this story may matter to you and your family and friends is that we all would never have learned any of these stories without my dad, his men, and his commanders having left written records, most of which were at least initially handwritten. His over 450 handwritten letters to his mother, his father, his best friend became indispensable for me. Without those handwritten and typed letters, I wouldn't have known where to look and what to look for. I wouldn't have known his feelings and emotions. I'd have been ignorant of almost all of these significant events and conversations. Folks, had he had social media, had he had texting and email, I'd have nothing. One of Dad's best friends read Stephen Ambrose's book, Citizen Soldiers, and gave Dad a copy with a handwritten note in it. He wrote this: "This is a wonderful book that tells a great story about men like you. In fact, it's about you. I did not realize who you were until I saw you through these great stories. Our nation owes you and many others a great debt. I always enjoyed our friendship. Now I'm honored by it." And I bet Dad would join me in encouraging each of you to consider beginning a habit of sending handwritten notes as often as you can to your family, loved ones, and friends. They'll never forget them, and they'll never throw them away. The third reason these stories could matter to you, and I'll end with this, could matter to you, your family, and your friends, is that I hope they will encourage you, as they've encouraged Barb and me, to rethink how we celebrate each Veterans Day and each Memorial Day. I mean, no question, we should enjoy fellowship and fun of cooking out and being with loved ones. But could we all consider this? Taking at least a few moments each of those days, one, to read a story or two out loud, or to share a video or two together, recognizing and remembering our past heroes. And number two, to pause, at least for a moment, to thank God together for the continued liberty and freedom that we now enjoy because of the exceptional heroes who served and continue to serve our country, and for those who fought and died for us. I remember visiting Dad's grave after researching his book, learning that what I thought were his unbelievable lies, that were unbelievable stories that were true. I remember what I was thinking that day, standing next to his grave. With tears of gratitude streaking down my cheeks, I said, "Dad, I always loved being your son. Now more than ever, I'm honored by it." I'm so thankful to have been asked to share these stories with you guys. I hope and pray they've been a blessing. May God continue to bless each one of you. May God continue to bless this sacred place, the Center for American Values. And may God continue to bless our beloved country, America. Thank you.
You would entertain a couple of questions? Okay, we'll have these questions. We'll ask them right back here at the middle so that the camera can get everybody watching online. I've got to think that my buddy Yvonne has got to have a question regarding this because she is an equestrian. So, Yvonne, do you have a question?
Oh, you're welcome.
Hold on here, let me.
Just so our people that are online can hear your criticism.
Yeah, my criticism. I don't even know what to ask, but I think I was meant to be here. I'm holding up a picture of my beloved venture, and I was the first lieutenant, and I had the great honor to ride in a general change of command at Fort Knox in the uniform of a U.S. cavalry soldier that was I drew from the Patton Museum. So I'm so grateful for your talk and for everything. And my sister lives only miles from Montélimar in France, and I am well acquainted with the gorge in the Rhone Valley, and we're just outside of Montélimar.
Thank you. Actually, when Brad called to ask if I wanted to come speak at the CAV, I said, well, the cavalry doesn't exist anymore. Center for American Values. Someone else?
Are there any other questions? Dr. Larimore, I just want to ask you about the moment that you really realized that all those lies were real stories. What happened?
Well, Kim's a great question. It was a process for me and my brothers. But initially, we didn't believe that people we interviewed, friends of his who he had told the stories to, the stories were actually remarkably the same from person to person. Normally, liars can't do that. They change their stories. And normally, liars' stories aren't published in history books. And normally, they're not attested to by people who witnessed it. And normally, they're not shared by those people with their children and grandchildren. So I had the privilege over 15 years to interview people that he fought with, friends that he shared the stories with, children and grandchildren, and all the stories were the same. And I felt embarrassed that I thought my dad was a liar. But I'm also sad because he fought with 2 million young American men in Europe. And how many other stories are there that we don't have, that we don't know about, that are just as wonderful and just as amazing? And I so hope all of us will be willing to take the time to leave our stories to our children and grandchildren and to the future generations. It will make a difference.